often I will kind of run sermon ideas past Cindy, my wife, for her to check them out, to see if they're appropriate, if it's okay for me to speak about these things. But clearly this was not one of those times. I didn't. I'm out on my own, out on a limb, and I understand that. And I don't claim to know a whole lot about childbirth. I was there on 4 different occasions to see the birth of my children, and honestly, that's enough for me. Yay me, I managed to stay upright the whole time for all of them. And I did whatever meager things I could do to try and support Cindy. Guys, we really know that we have no understanding of this process, of what goes on. I did my best. She did all the work. But it's interesting that Jesus uses the metaphor of childbirth in his conversation with Nicodemus. He says, you must be born again. What does that mean? Now, our evangelical brothers and sisters talk about being born again as that singular event, that time when each of us individually decides that we are going to become a disciple of Jesus. We are going to be a follower of Jesus. We are going to become a Christian. And while that explains some of the intent behind Jesus' words, I think there's more to it. That it's bigger than just that one event. So what does it mean that we must be born again? Well, here is what I know about childbirth. And I think if we understand this one aspect of birth, it helps explain Jesus' intent in this message. Now, I know, again, I'm going out on a limb here, but this is what I know. None of us remembers our birth. None of us really had anything to do with it. We did not initiate the process. We didn't decide, hey, I'm going to be born. I would like to have life. We didn't decide when we were going to be born. We didn't initiate anything. It's not something that we achieved or with some kind of success, like, yay me, I'm born. I chose to do that. When we are in the womb, when a child is in the womb, birth is something that happens to them. It happened to each of us. So when Jesus says, we must be born again, I think that's part of what he's trying to get at. Some of what he's trying to say, that the rebirth that happens within us is initiated only by God. That's what happens. That it's God's initiation. It's not anything that we do. It's part of the process of coming to life. And it's not necessarily just a singular event, just a one-off. It happens one time, but it's an over and over and over again thing. We're in the midst of our sermon series, kind of at the end of it today, pushing through the dirt, finding hope in the storms of life. And we've been thinking about like growth and gardens and seeds, recognizing that as we plant a seed, it's in that context that it goes from something that looks dead, and we immerse it in the soil, in the ground, in the darkness. And there, it connects to moisture from the rain or our watering. And it responds to the change of temperatures from the longer days and the more intense sunlight. And it's through those processes that new life emerges. That something new happens only because of having to go through these other things. And that's some of what Jesus is saying here. None of us likes to go through the storms. We talked a little bit last week about none of us stands in the ring, Rocky Balboa style, saying, come on, bring on some pain, some punishment. I need some more of that. We don't desire it. And yet, without those processes, without the process that the seed go through, they never will fulfill God's design for them. They can't come out the other side. One way to understand some of this process is by seeing it as the letter J. Kind of the J curve. There's a seed that is planted and it's immersed in the ground, and it goes through all the things that it goes through, the pressure and the difficulties and the turmoil and responding to the different situations until it can rise again to life. So Nicodemus, in his conversation with Jesus, did not understand that. It didn't make any sense to him. What do you mean I have to be born again? Am I to climb back in my mother's womb? And Jesus says, no, it's a birth of the Spirit. It's something that happens maybe not the one time when we come to faith, but something that happens again and again and again. We die to self. And we're birthed into something completely new and different, more and more in the image of and likeness of Jesus. A few weeks ago when we started this sermon series, a few girls came up and we planted these. We had these pots and we put some soil in and we put some seeds in, and they watered them and they're starting to grow. And they go from something that doesn't look like much to something amazing and beautiful. And perhaps that's what we go through, these storms of life. The things, none of us desires them or wants them, but the result of them is that they weaken our sinful nature. And they allow us to spring to life, to become something more grand, more in line with the person that God created us to be, more in the image of Christ, over and over again. It's not anything that we can do ourselves. As a matter of fact, we don't intentionally pursue storms or pursue challenges or difficulties in order to try and get God's attention or to try and make penance, to say, I'm paying for my sins by doing these things. Hope you notice me, God. I'm doing all I can to work to earn your favor. Nothing we do, no storm that we go through, that we initiate, will ever be sufficient to pay for our sin. It is only through God's initiative, as we live and embrace the experience, that we begin to understand the new life that occurs as a result. See, we can only respond to those circumstances. That's what allows us, in the midst of challenges and difficulties, to not fear, to recognize that God promises something different on the other end. That each and every time I go through these things, that I face these struggles, that I have these questions or doubts, every time I come out the other side more and more in the likeness of Jesus. What do we do with that? How are we to understand, to accept Jesus' words, you must be born again? What does it mean? Well, first of all, it means that we understand that God is the one that initiates everything. That those storms that we go through are things that we go through throughout the entirety of our lives. They are kind of a reenactment, if you like, of the experience of Jesus, what Jesus went through, the death and resurrection of Jesus. And that happens in our lives over and over and over again. We're more and more every time formed in the likeness of Jesus. Secondly, we recognize that those J curves are all based on the experience that Jesus went through. His death and resurrection is, again, what gives us hope in circumstances that don't make sense to us, in circumstances that may seem like they're going to crush us. They don't. They're an opportunity for us to understand even more fully God's love and faithfulness. As we come out the other side, more and more like the person God desires us to be. We've realized, thirdly, that each of those storms, each of those struggles are an opportunity for us to die a little bit more to self. To re-emerge as someone more in the image of Christ. It's why we gather together on Sunday mornings. That's why we're here. That's what we hope. We recognize that Jesus is the one that we want to emulate, that we want to be like, and yet we fall short of that. We confess every week, God, I'm not there yet. Help me to be more and more your person. And some of that is this process of going through these difficulties, that we can emerge, that we trust and emerge on the other side. In the end, the hope is that we do become the person that God desires us to be, that we do reflect the image of Jesus, that we do kind of emerge to something new. Sometimes we kind of get stuck in the struggle or the difficulty. We kind of think this is it. But we need to understand that the descent is not the destination. The descent is simply the runway to the rising. It's bringing us to something else, something new, something better. God is initiating these things that we may be formed. And it's something, again, that happens over and over and over again. We never quite get it till we take our last breath. We repeat this process of death and resurrection, death to self, alive to Christ. Because ultimately, in the end, isn't it really Jesus who we all desire to be like? That's why we come. Amen.